Many times I've been on here, I talk about creating wildlife habitat and trying to increase the value of your property for wildlife. Based on what Billy was talking about, he did a really good job discussing options on how you can be a great caretaker of your property and, getting with professionals and trying to improve things to meet the goals of your property. And hopefully, wildlife may be one of those goals. And at the very least, a healthy forest is good for wildlife, even if it's not one of your goals. But let's kind of turn this around a little bit and talk a bit about what can wildlife do for you in some ways, or at the very least, what is wildlife doing for you and you don't know it. Woodlands do play this vital role as a place for wildlife to exist, to live, providing some or all of what these species need to survive and reproduce. Whether that's the food coming off of those white oaks that are there for deer and bear and turkeys and all kinds of animals, or whether it's just the structure of the vegetation itself, giving a place for a bird to build a nest and raise its young. Um, all of that's there, but what is going on in the background that kind of is this interplay between wildlife and the woodlands? Often we jump to this idea of the recreational use. That's the value that can be brought, and it makes sense as it's a very common recreational use of wildlife. It's one that about 1 in 20 Americans partake in, right? So about 5% of the country is a person that buys a hunting license. And there's a lot of economic benefits that come from that, in terms of our economy within the state, nationally. If you look at, on average, a hunter is going to spend a little over $3,000 to partake in this recreational activity. And this can be a huge influx of funds into rural areas, whether that be in hotels or restaurants, gas stations, or one that we're going to talk about in a little bit here, where they're purchasing access to properties to partake in this recreational activity, especially if they're not landowners themselves. On top of that, the value that wildlife brings, so for if you are lucky enough to harvest one of these animals, it can be a substantial amount of high quality, nutritious food for your personal consumption or family's consumption. Or in many cases now, pretty much every state that has hunting has some form of a Hunters for the Hungry program where folks that are lucky enough to have a surplus of individual animals on their property, maybe they have problems with things like crop damage. They're harvesting more than they personally need to consume, and they can donate that high quality, nutritious meal to a food bank using this program, Hunters for the Hungry. In Kentucky alone, we're looking at, somewhere, off the top of my head, I may be wrong, but I believe it was about 50,000 pounds of venison was donated in Kentucky last year, providing, tons and tons of meals to folks that may be not in a great situation. And that is high quality protein, which is usually the most expensive part of a meal. And the state views that as a valuable program and actually provides funds, whether that through the state itself or private entities donating to have the animals processed for free at no cost to the hunters. So it is a recreational opportunity that provides an influx into economies, as well as providing a nutritious meal to either the families that harvest it or potentially those who are a little less fortunate at the time. So that's a big value that wildlife can bring. Specifically in Kentucky, if you want to break that down, Billy mentioned the approximately $18 billion economic impact that the forest industry has. In the fish and wildlife recreation realm in the state of Kentucky, it's estimated to be about a $6 billion industry, and it's supporting about 70,000 jobs. We have quite a few participants. This is lumping in fishing, boating, hunting, and wildlife recreation. So that can be things like wildlife photography, bird watching, all of that. It is a major input into Kentucky tourism. It's making up almost half of that industry based on these estimates. So it is a driving force to bringing people into Kentucky and potentially bring value to your property, depending on what kind of interest you have and how you want to use your property. I mentioned that economic gain can be realized by our woodland owners, many of which are realizing it in one way or another, even if they are not participants in hunting as a recreational activity. Um, and that is through the idea of hunt leasing. So this is where individuals who are partaking in hunting or fishing or other recreational opportunities are basically paying access to the landowner to access the land. Um, and partake in that activity. And the values can range quite a bit and are related to the resources present on the property, the situation of how large the property is, what kind of amenities are there, where is that property in the state, and what is basically playing into is what kind of experience can the leasee have within that property. And that will, either increase the value of the property or potentially keep it at a lower level. And some of that can be out of the leasee's hands, the owner's hands. Sorry, not the leasee. Where if you have a property in Southeast Kentucky and have elk on it, then you have a resource that's much more limited than most of the rest of the state. And if you're someone that is trying to potentially have elk hunting as a business. If you're an elk guide, then you're not going to be interested in trying to lease out property out by Lake Cumberland. Let's say you're going to want to have it in the area that's open to hunting. The same holds true for things like waterfowl, especially if you are in an area that has a lot of waterfowl present. There's a lot of resource there. Then your value of that property is going to go up. And the by no means is this necessarily going to be the only thing that the landowner uses to make money, but it can be a substantial amount of income depending on your personal situation. I have heard rates as high as $60 an acre on an annual basis for hunt leasing for deer in certain counties. And can be even higher in situations per se elk leases or specific waterfowl scenarios that are maybe immediately adjacent to a wetland refuge, where there's only so many places that can have access to those birds and hunting those birds. When I was in the Eastern Shore doing my master's work, a lot of the goose pits that were right next to the refuges in a single cornfield could go upwards of almost six figures, depending on where you were and the market that was available for those interested in leasing them. But more widespread, outside of the hunt lease component, more widespread of the value that wildlife bring to your woodlands is usually directly related to the ecological services that those species have in that system. And it's really hard to put a dollar amount on a lot of these activities that are really a vital role for making your woodlands function like it's supposed to. We're going to go over a few different main ones per se, but if you lose a vital species in a system, that system's never going to be the same, and it's hard to necessarily replace that individual species there with other ones. They just don't operate the same. Often, we can overlook things that we see on a regular basis. Right. So often I look out my back window in my yard and I see a squirrel running around with a acorn and not think about, well, that squirrel's just burying that nut for next year or this winter to find and to eat at a later time. So caching that acorn is only for that squirrel in my mind. But in reality, being squirrels and chipmunks and many rodents cache a lot of acorns and other nuts that they do not consume that play into the regeneration of our future trees and other plants. On top of that, they're moving seeds around very quickly and putting them in places that maybe there wasn't an oak tree before or in the recent past. They are now putting an acorn there that could be an oak tree in the future and help move these species to places they can't, right? Trees can't walk around and start throwing their acorns everywhere. They're stuck in one spot. So they need something to do that for them. And in many cases, wildlife are the things that do that. And in some extreme cases of seed dispersal, they actually require wildlife to be a component of that. So some species like our raspberry and blackberries actually need to pass through the gizzard of a bird in order to germinate and become a plant in the future. So they not only do they need that bird to move them around, they also need that bird to activate the seed. Other ones that we are often thinking about, especially now in time where we hear about monarchs and bees being not necessarily in great shape, we're very familiar with the idea of pollination and the role that plays in making sure that we have seeds for future plants as well as food for ourselves. Many of our bats and birds and bees and all the other insects are playing this really vital role of pollinating plants as they go around, not even knowing what they're doing, right? They're not signing up for this job. They're just going about trying to get some food, but they're also playing an incredibly vital role to make sure that these plants are reproducing and having more success and having other plants, and seeds for the next generation. This is incredibly true if you are a big tequila drinker, where you need a very specific bat species that likes the agave plants, so that you have that tequila present in the future. So those are kind of two that we grasp on pretty easy, and they're really direct, right? So squirrels plant acorns, acorns turn into oak trees, so on and so forth. Hummingbirds go from plant to plant. They get nectar, but they also are bringing pollen with them. Straightforward. One of the bigger ones that is sometimes a little harder to kind of grasp how important it is can involve the idea of pest management. And often these pests are wildlife and insect species themselves. So these are kind of just us trying to grow food in a system and other things like that food we're growing. So we somewhat need to rely on the natural predators to help us deal with that problem. And I'm going to try to focus on the examples of where we have tried to control the pests themselves and failed miserably because it's really hard to do sometimes. For example, we do a lot of spraying in agriculture and yet still have problems with insect pests. And bats have been identified as one that plays an incredibly important role. And bats are not alone here, but plays an incredibly important role in consuming a lot of those insects in these areas and play a vital role in the agricultural system to keep insect numbers down and keep our crop production up. Estimates are very wide ranging because it's really hard to calculate this, but we're talking billions of dollars in services, not necessarily millions. So they are incredibly important, just out there doing their thing to our lives and our production of food. On top of that, rodents is another really probably one of the worst in terms of mammals, one of the worst agricultural pests worldwide. So anything that consumes a rodent is a win. So things like raptors and snakes can do this really efficiently. I had that barn owl there, a picture of it here on the pest management slide. This owl is in a vineyard in California, and they have really started pushing in these vineyards in California to get away from using rodenticide and relying a lot more on barn owls and putting up barn owl nesting boxes because they're consuming thousands of rodents in these fields a year and do so at a much higher rate than even using the toxicants, which are becoming more and more restricted in that state. A nest of barn owls, they're basically consuming 3 to 5 dozen rodents a day. So imagine like all these not so pretty, not so cute looking babies, right? They're a little weird looking at times. They are adorable to their parents, I'm sure. But they eat a lot of voles and mice every day as they grow. So they're consuming more than the rodents are reproducing, therefore getting a net positive for keeping agricultural damage down. So things like snakes, things like owls, and things like coyotes and foxes, bobcats are all doing this and working towards it. So there's a big benefit from having those predators around in the rodent control department. On top of that, these guys are consuming pests, but they're also playing this cleanup crew role where our scavengers are out there as animals die, whether that's wildlife or potentially livestock. Um, their bodies are decomposing on the landscape. Well, the longer they're out there decomposing, the more bacterial growth you have, and the possibility of actually creating a problem in terms of bacteria in the future. We do a lot of work giving antibiotics to animals, and we're basically kind of playing this constant game of trying not to create a superbug. And getting more dead animals off the landscape means less bacteria on the landscape, which is a net positive for that goal. So having things like vultures and coyotes out there consuming a lot of dead animals, right? So we have a lot of deer vehicle collisions. Not every county is able to get those animals off the landscape quickly. The vultures are doing it for us. So they're providing a real benefit. And in a very indirect way, they're also doing something that in other countries where they've lost vultures because of poisoning. They had things like rabies outbreaks because feral dogs were filling that role. And there was a rabies outbreak, and all of a sudden, those feral dogs were biting humans. So it became a huge public health concern just because the dog population filled into that role of eating carrion. They had a huge burst of dogs, in terms of explosion of dogs because of all the food that was available. And then transferred into something else that was really unexpected. So these guys are really kind of playing this role that none of us want to go out and pick up dead animals out of the landscape, especially in 90 degrees in July. Let's let the vultures kind of do it for us. One that is kind of a benefit and a problem all at the same time is wetlands provide us a huge service in terms of being able to buffer against floods, water quality improvements, and so on and so forth. And many times we're relying on, in some systems, relying on beavers to create those wetlands by building dams and slowing down the flow of water. And if you live immediately next to those dams, you may actually be getting a net negative on this because the flooding is going to happen at your property. But if you live downstream, it's a bonus. So everything here seems to be a plus minus, and that's really true with a lot of wildlife. But there are still things going on in terms of the system that are positive. And one of these is, you get those ponding, the wetland areas get created, they kind of expand at the same time and do provide some buffer from kind of flooding events. Lastly here, the one that is a value net gain, I will say is personal enjoyment and fulfillment of having wildlife on your property. It's hard to see that gain, but there's a lot of research that shows that activities in the recreation, having animals on your property, those that enjoy that idea and are not. This is the non-consumptive side. It really boosts, their happiness level. There's evidence that going through activities like forest management and then seeing the gain of those wildlife as indicators of success really helps kind of ensure that that what you did was a positive for the system, and you're then more likely to continue active management because the wildlife are acting kind of as that feedback mechanism of success. We often overlook that, but it does provide a huge mental and emotional benefit and value to your woodland and to yourself as a woodland owner to see those wildlife species there, even on the non-consumptive side. I threw the snake up there just because, yes, they fall into that category too. If you look, that little girl is smiling. They're ones that we often overlook as bringing enjoyment and value, but they really are one that does so. And with that, that's kind of really quick synopsis of some of the values that wildlife can bring to your woodlands, whether that be direct economic impact or emotional and happiness gain from having your woodlands.